In part 1 of this series, we got a basic introduction to Vue. So now here in part 2, let's jump in and start to put together an example. To set up this example, I'm just going to create a new directory, and I'm going to call it Flashword, which is the name of the application we're going to be building in this series. Then within this directory, I'm going to start off with a index file. And then for some starting code, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video. I have a template we can start off with. So I'll just copy this from the notes. Paste that in there. And then I will also create a JavaScript file called app.js. And if we take a look at the index file, you can see I've already set a script element here to pull in that external JavaScript file for us. Preceding that, we also have a script element that's pulling in the actual Vue.js framework. And we're getting this from an external CDN or content delivery network, which is good for this starting example. It's just a really quick and easy way to pull in this package into this code base. Later in the series, we will look at things like Node Package Manager, where we can actually download a copy of Vue so it is integrated into our project. But for now, just for this basic example, like I said, this will just allow us to really hit the ground running without having to worry about package management, all of those things. All right, so we've got access to Vue. We've got a place where we can write our own JavaScript that's going to utilize Vue. Following that, I have some basic CSS to style the elements we're going to be working with in this example. And then finally, down in the body of the page, I have some HTML to kick off our application. So let's go ahead and load this. So we've got it open in the browser before we start writing any JavaScript. So I'm just going to go to File, Open File, navigate to the directory where I've written this code, which I've already got it set up here. So you can see it's pointing to that Flashword directory. And I just want to open this index.html file. And this is exactly what we should be seeing at this point. And so with our example set up, coming back to the code, let's focus on the JavaScript we're going to write. And what we need to do, the way every Vue application starts, is you create a new Vue instance. And often we like to store those instances in a variable or a constant just in case we need to reference it later. So I'm going to create a constant for this, and I'm just going to call it app. And then I'm going to set it to be a new instance of this Vue object. In this Vue object, we have access to this because remember, we are pulling in the Vue.js framework, so it's built into that. And within that object, there's a method we want to invoke called createApp. Now we're going to want to feed this some options to essentially configure our Vue instance. We'll come back to that in a moment, but just to complete this statement, the other thing we want to do after we create the app is we want to attach it to an element on our page. And the way we're going to do that is using a method called mount. And then we're going to give it a selector of the element we want to attach this instance to. And in this case, I want to attach it to this div that I have here with an ID of app. So the selector I'm going to use is, because I'm dealing with an ID, I'm going to use the # and then just the name app. All right, and that's another key thing to understand about working with something like Vue is you create these instances and then you essentially like plug them into your HTML, right? So basically we're saying we want this div to be powered by Vue. All of the functionality that we get with Vue, we're going to want to utilize it within this particular div. That's what we're doing when we're mounting it to that element. So that line creates our Vue instance. And then backing up here, I mentioned we want to give it some options. And this is really where we start to program how this Vue instance is going to work. And the way we're going to give our options is we're going to give it a JavaScript object that's going to have different properties set within that object. And I could write it directly here within the createApp method invocation, but typically what you'll see is you'll create like a whole separate constant with your options, which you'll then pass to createApp. So following that pattern, I would do something like this. I'm just going to create an object. I'll name it after my application. I'll just call it Flashword, set it up as an empty object, and then that is what I'm going to pass to the createApp method. Now digging into the object, let's start to set up our options for this application. And typically the first option you're going to be dealing with is called the data option. This is where you're going to specify the data points of your application. And the way we need to set this up is we're going to create a function called data, and we're going to have it return an object where we're going to define our data properties. For example, the first data property we want to have is correlated to what I had set up in the template. I had this use of word A. This is going to represent the word that we're trying to get the visitor to translate. So I'll set up a property for that called word A. And just to begin with, I'm just going to hard code the first word that we want to challenge the visitor with. And we'll start it real simple. We'll just say hola. And then related to that, we need to know what the translation of that is. And I'll store that under our data property we'll call word B. And that would just be hello. So that's the pattern we're looking at for setting up data properties of our Vue instance. We set them up within this object that's returned from this function called data. We're going to add on to this. There's going to be other data properties we're going to need for the functionality of this. But just to begin with, we're going to start with the word we're asking the visitor to translate and essentially the solution. And with that, I want to check in and actually run this in the browser just to make sure that all of the code I've written here to create this new Vue instance is working without error. So let's go back to the browser and I'm going to refresh my page. And the first thing we should observe is our word.a data property is actually being output in our interface here. And the way it's doing that is using a feature within Vue.js called text interpolation. If we go back to our template, the way we text interpolate or output data to the screen is using these double curly brackets on either side of some JavaScript expression. And in this case, our expression is just referencing that word.a data property. So Vue will dynamically inject that value right here in this template. So that's going to be pretty useful, but here's where it really starts to get interesting. As we dynamically update this data property, we should see those updates reflected in the interface because a lot of the data we work with in Vue instances is reactive, right? When we say that data is reactive, it means that if it changes in one place, anywhere else where we're using that data, we're going to see that change reflected. To show you what I mean, let's go back to the browser. And I don't have a way in the interface yet to actually update that word.a data property, but I can do it using the web inspector. So to pull that up, I'm just going to right click on the page and go to inspect and then switch over to my console tab. And as you know, if you've worked with JavaScript before, any JavaScript we write in this console will be reflected here on this page in real time. So what I want to do is I want to update that word.a data property. And the way I'm going to access the data property is, you'll recall when we created a Vue instance, we set it in a constant called app. So I'm going to start by referencing that. And then to get to the data option that we set up specifically, I'm going to use $data. That's going to reveal all of my underlying data within this Vue instance. And you can see as I type that in, it's actually pre-filling. We can see our object with word A and word B. And I want to reference word A, so I'm going to say word A, and let's go ahead and change it. So I'm going to just change it to another string. We'll change it to adios. All right, then I'll run that, and we can instantly see that reflected in our interface. It dynamically changed because we changed that data property. Now, that might not seem very impressive because we did have to go and do it behind the scenes via the console. Obviously not something we're going to ask our visitors to do. So let's set up an example that does replicate the kind of things our visitors would do, where we can observe this reactive behavior. And to do this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a text input where the user can actually type in their answer. So let's go back to our template. And right below our prompt, let's do an input type text. And what I want to do is I want to essentially attach this text input to one of our data options. And specifically, I'm going to create a new data option to track the answer that the user enters. So let's set that up. We'll just call it answer. And I'll go ahead and initialize it as an empty string, just because when we first load this Vue instance, we don't have an answer yet. We don't know what it is. So we'll start out with an empty string. And then once I've set up that data option, coming back to my input, I'm going to add what is called the Vue directive. And the first Vue directive we want to look at is the model directive. And the syntax is going to look like this. It's going to be v-model. And then we're going to set it to some value. And in this case, I want to model this input after my answer data property. So I'm simply going to set it to be answer. So what we're doing here is we're effectively binding this input to this data option. And just to see this, let's also use the answer as just like a basic output on the page. So I'll just have a paragraph that says you answered. And then again, using our text interpolation syntax, that double mustache syntax, we're going to output the answer data property. All right, so now we've got one data property that we're using in two different places. One, we're binding it via the v-model directive to this input, and we're also text interpolating it or outputting it to the page. So saving those changes, coming back to the browser, let's refresh it. And on initial page load, we see an empty input and we don't see anything for the answer. And this makes sense because remember, when we set up that data property answer, we set it to be an empty string. But now let's change it. And the way I'm going to change it is I'm just going to enter my answer in this text input. So I'll enter hello. And you'll see every character I type is dynamically changing that. And then down here where we're outputting it, we're seeing that reflected here. right? Because both of these things are tied to that answer data property. If I delete it, it goes away. If I type it out, it shows up again. If I bring up my console, make another change here. So I'll just hit the up arrow to bring my last change. This time, instead of changing word A, I'm going to change answer. And just as an example, I'll just set it to ABC. What we should see is it's going to update our input and our output on the page. And again, it's because we've created like a dependency of these elements on that data property, and it's all reactive. If something changes to that data property, it will react here. We will see those changes reflected. Moving on, let's optimize this example. I think it would be ideal if when we first loaded the page, we actually didn't see this text that said you answered, because we don't know what the answer is yet, so we shouldn't see that. And the way I'm going to handle that, coming back to my template, is I'm going to use another Vue directive. This time I'm going to use the if directive. And just like our V model, it's going to start off with v dash. All of our directives we're going to work with in Vue, they always start with v dash something. In this case, it's v if. And the value I'm going to set here is a Boolean expression that if it evaluates to true, this paragraph element will be rendered on the page. If it doesn't, if it evaluates to false, we just won't see this in our document. So the Boolean expression I'll use for this is I'm going to look at that answer data property, and I'm going to say if it's not equal to an empty string, then we should go ahead and render this paragraph on the page. So again, let me save those changes, come back, refresh our interface, and there we go. We're not seeing that text yet until we actually start to type in an answer. And then once we do, then it gets rendered. And this is going to be a really important tool, because anytime we're building interactive interfaces, it's often just about hiding or showing content depending on different conditions. And using the directive like v-if allows us to do that. And later we'll see how in addition to v-if, there's also things like v-else, v-else-if, all of those combinations we are typically accustomed when it comes to conditionals in programming. We can use them here in our Vue interfaces as well. Moving on, another important directive I want to sample in this example is a v-on directive, which will allow us to listen for specific actions from the user. For example, we will probably want to have a button as part of this interface that the user can click to check their answer. And what we want to do with this button is we want to listen for when the visitor clicks it. So we're going to use the v-on directive, and we're going to follow that up with an argument. Arguments are just ways we can pass extra configuration to our directives. In this case, the argument we want is what is the action that we're listening for here? And in this case, it's going to be a click. And then for the value I'm going to set this to is some JavaScript that I want to execute when they click this button. So thinking through this, the JavaScript that we're going to need to execute is to check their answer to see if it matches word B, which is the word that we're looking for. So to do this, first of all, I'm going to create a new data property. Let's call it correct. And this will ultimately have a Boolean value of true or false as to whether they got it correct. We will initialize it though as just as a null value, because when we first come to the page, we don't know if it's correct. Then coming back to our click listener, we're going to update correct. And we're going to set it to be either true or false, depending on whether their answer matches word B. So we could write that simply as a Boolean expression. We're just going to say word B, and we're going to use the comparison operator to see if word B is equivalent to the answer. And if that is true, then correct will be true. Otherwise, correct will be false. Then below our button, we can produce some output using that correct data property. So let's have like a paragraph that says, you got it. That's what we'll display if they got it correct. Otherwise, we'll have another paragraph that says, sorry, please try again. And then we'll sprinkle in some Vue directives to decide which of these paragraphs to display. So the first one will display if correct is true. Otherwise, and we'll use the v-else directive, this paragraph will display. Now this will work as expected once we've set correct to be either true or false, once we click this button. Before that though, when correct is null on initial page load, what'll happen is this paragraph will actually display, right? Because it'll look at this one and say, okay, well correct isn't true, so it's not going to display this, but it will display this. And that's not what we want. We don't want to give them negative feedback right from the get-go. So one way we could address this, we could actually expand this to a v-else-if, and we could look that the correct value is not equal to null. So that essentially covers our three cases. Case number one, we first come to the page, correct is null. We won't see this. We also won't see this. Case number two is we click the button, now correct is either true, in which case we'd see this, or case number three, we've clicked the button, correct is false, then we would see this. And let's just go ahead and test that, show that quickly. So coming back to our application, I'm just going to refresh it. And as you can see, I don't see any feedback when we first load the page. But if I type in an answer and click check answer, we get our positive feedback. Whereas if I type in an incorrect answer, we get our negative feedback. So that's working as expected, but I think it would be clearer if we were a little bit more explicit here. And what if we just took our feedback that we're giving and wrap it in a div that would conditionally display whether or not it's time to give feedback? Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to create a div that we will conditionally display, and I'll come up with another data property. Let's anticipate that we'll call it show feedback, right? If that's true, then one of our paragraphs of feedback will display, right? And then we don't need this extra if here. We could just simply use this as an else in combination with this v-if. All right, and then the show feedback data property, we'll initialize that on page load as false. We don't want to show any feedback when the page first loads, but then coming back to our click listener, we'll add on to our current expression and we'll update show feedback to be true. And let's just go ahead and test this quick, make sure it's working as expected. All right, so here's initial page load. We don't see any feedback. We enter a correct guess. We click our button. We got our positive feedback. And then we enter an incorrect guess, click our button again, and we see our try again feedback. So the end result is the same, but I just think that this approach is a little bit clearer. It's more explicit as to what's going on. And this idea of creating data properties that act almost as toggle switches for parts of your interface is something that you're going to use a lot as you're working with Vue. So this was a good opportunity to take a look at that technique. And just to put some finishing touches on this, I do have some CSS I had included as part of the template for our correct and incorrect feedback. So I'm going to add those classes to our paragraphs. So now if we test this again, we enter a correct answer, we should get green feedback, and then a incorrect answer should yield red feedback. So it looks like that's in good working order. And now that it is working, I do want to rewind a little bit to this JavaScript expression that I wrote here to respond to this click event. What I've done here, I've got two parts of this expression. The first one that is updating correct, and the second one is updating show feedback. And for something as simple as that, to write it in line here with our button itself is not a big deal, but you can imagine that the things we're going to want to do in responses to things like clicks can start to get more complex than this. We might have 3, 4, 10 different lines of JavaScript we need to execute when a button is clicked. And so when that starts to happen, it makes sense to take this JavaScript logic and outsource it to a method that we can add to our Vue options. And this actually brings us to another option we can give to our Vue instances. In addition to our data, we can also have a methods option. So I'm going to tack this on. We're just going to call it methods, and we're going to set it to be an object of different methods we want to use in this application. So the first method I'm going to create, let's call it check answer. And what we want to happen in here is the same thing we were doing inline. In fact, I'm just going to cut this out of there, move it over to our JavaScript. All right, now that we're here, we can bump each statement to its own line. And the other thing we need to do now that we're working within this object context is we need to prefix each of our data properties with the keyword this, basically indicating that we're talking to properties of this current instance. If we didn't do this, it would just treat these properties as if they were local variables of this method. Now, this step wasn't necessary when we were referencing our data properties in our template, and that's just because how the template is processed, it's not necessary to include this there. Basically, when the Vue instance is mounted to this template, it's going to be implied that we're referencing the data properties of this instance. So now that we've got our check answer method all set up, let's set that to be what's invoked when we click on this button. And let's go ahead and test it out. Looks good. I'll enter an incorrect answer. Perfect. And with that, we have a pretty good rudimentary start to our Flashword application that we could build upon in this series. Before I wrap up this video, though, I do want to address, you may have noticed every time I refresh the application, there's this like momentary blip where we see all the content of our template on the page. And to show this, I'm just going to rapidly refresh it a few times in a row so you can really see that happening. All right, that's not ideal. What's going on there is if we look back at our template, you know, we have several elements of content here, things like the paragraph where we show the answer, the div where we show the feedback, which once Vue is loaded, those things are going to be obscured. But what's happening is when this page is first loaded, it's just HTML that's getting rendered, right? Before JavaScript comes in, there's nothing that turns this paragraph off or turns this div off. And that's what we're seeing there. We're just seeing that momentary second when that content's there. But then once the JavaScript is loaded, once our Vue instance is mounted, it obscures that. So the end result is our interface looks as expected, but it's just a little sloppy to have to see that blip of content happen. And so one way to address that is Vue has a feature they called cloaking, where you can essentially cloak the application until the Vue instance is mounted, at which point it will show the content. To implement cloaking, what we have to do is we want to go to our the div or whatever element we're mounting our instance to, and we're going to add an attribute v-cloak. And it looks like at some point here I lost the end of this div tag, so I'll go ahead and add that at the end. All right, then the other thing we're going to do in our CSS is we're going to style this attribute, and we're going to set it to display none. So it's going to hide all of our content. And then when the Vue instance mounts, it's going to automatically remove this attribute, and that will effectively then remove the styling that's hiding it, and it will show the content. All right, let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to set a attribute for the v-cloak, and the syntax for selecting an element by attribute is we just put the attribute in square brackets. So we'll say v-cloak, and then for the style, we'll say display none. And let's go ahead and test that out. So I'm going to refresh the page, and that's what we're looking for. There still is a little bit of a flash that's happening, but it's just basically the div isn't there, the JavaScript loads, then it is there. Which is better than what we were seeing before, which was like the inner guts of our template. We were just seeing that immediately. So I think that's a good stopping point for this video. To conclude things, I do want to jump back to the notes and just highlight that at the end I have a summary of the key things we've talked about in this video. And remember, the point of this video is really to give you a broad sampling of some of the primary tools we're going to be using in Vue. Each of these things I talked about, from working with options within your Vue instance to other Vue directives, we're going to break into them in more detail in upcoming videos in the series. The other thing I want to mention is that right now, to begin with, we are working with a style of Vue that is referred to as the options API. This whole idea of creating an object with different options for things like data and methods. This is one style of programming with Vue. Another style that was introduced in Vue version 3 is something called the composition API, which is a slightly different way of organizing your application. And that is something we will be talking about in this series. I will introduce the composition API and talk about it versus the options API, why you would choose one or the other. All right, now, if you're not familiar with either of those things, it's not something you need to worry about right now. It's more just something for those of you who are wondering. I did want to note that we'd be covering both of those approaches. All right, and then finally, you'll notice at the end of the notes, there's also a practice exercise to play around with some of the things we've talked about in this video. And the task here is to add a reset button that appears once the user has guessed the correct answer. And this button should reset the answer to a blank string and hide the feedback on the page. So basically, once we've entered our answer and we get feedback, play around with adding a reset button that would clear out the answer, clear out the feedback, basically bring us back to the blank slate of when we first load the page. So try your hand out at that, and in the next part of the series, part 3, I will start the video with a solution so you can compare and contrast it with what you came up with.